Hello, I'm Lee
안녕하세요.
Jong-yun from the Book and Consumption Pro Book Club.
I'm Jongsu Jin. If you haven't read the books we discussed, please buy, read, and enjoy them.
We created this channel to read more and read well. If you haven't read the books, I hope you'll buy and read them deeply. What book are we reading today? That's the purpose of this channel. What book are we planning to read today?
Today we will be reading Han Kang's The Unremarkable.
It's an interesting book.
Last time we read The Boy Comes, a novel. Even though it is definitely the second content, many people, I thought we should do another book by Han Kang because of all the comments, likes, and views. I just couldn't hold back from reading it.
Yes, that's right. Thanks to you, I feel like I'm getting to read a lot of good books. Today, I matched my outfit with the cover.
I missed that. Looks like I matched it.
It's a bit of a sad story, but I tried to lighten the mood and say some nonsense.
Sounds good. While watching Lee Jong-un, who prepares a lot for the show, I also wore a snowflake-shaped necklace. Wow!
After filming the last video for The Boy Comes, I was so exhausted that I thought I could never do it again. That's right. Somehow we ended up doing it again this time. It was a bit tough to read this time too. I think Susie must have had a hard time too. It was tough, yes, experiencing the pain of others vividly. In part 1, we experience Kyung-hwa's pain, and in part 2, we share the suffering of the victims of the Jeju. 4.3 incident with a friend. I briefly thought that enduring and bearing this pain might be a form of love. Susie, what did you think of this book?
It felt similar to when I read The Boy Comes. While reading, the descriptions and the dreamlike, fantastical feeling really stood out, like the moments when you connect with the souls of the dead. It makes you ponder about crossing the line between life and death, wondering if this is that or if that is this. I felt like it was continuously linked to the previous works as I read through the book. The tragedies in the book and past are linked. The protagonist's journey to Jeju reveals victims' sorrow, deeply affecting me. I kept wondering why the protagonist went to Jeju, and when I got to that part, hearing the heartbreaking testimonies from the victims really hit me hard again. It was truly painful. Hearing the testimonies from the scene really made me feel the pain again. And it hurt so much.
That's right. It's tough for the reader. I can only imagine how hard it must have been for the writer.
Exactly. While writing this, I honestly wondered how the author could manage to live.
It's an amazing book. As Sujin mentioned, the descriptions felt even more vivid this time. I could really feel all 5 senses, sight, hearing, touch, especially more intensely, and even taste and smell, to the point where I could almost experience them.
Yes, occasionally there are expressions about that. Keep going.
Yes. So it felt like everything was conveyed in detail. I realized that a text can evoke such feelings, like seeing a sad yet beautiful piece of art through Han Kang's writing.
As always, Han Kang's book felt like a movie. This time too. In many ways,
There's definitely a sense of presence in it. Let's talk about the book for a moment. Of course, it would be the most fun to read the book while watching this broadcast, but still, if we wait just 2 or 3 days, we might get confused. It's easy to get confused about the characters. Let's briefly dive into the story of this book. In part 1, the narrator is the writer Kyung-ha. After publishing a book about a massacre that took place in a city, he continues to suffer from nightmares. He was also writing a will, and in the midst of that, he received a call from Kyung-ha and hurried to the hospital. Kyung-ha was in a situation where 2 of his fingers were cut off while he was cutting a tree, and this was right after he had surgery to stitch them up. So he tells Kyung-ha to go to Jeju Island. There's a parrot in his studio, yes. If I don't go and give him food and water today, he might die. So Kyung-ha actually met Inseon while out for a walk, and he goes to Jeju Island just like that, in the same outfit. When I got there, it was snowing heavily. The journey to find the house in the middle of the mountain is very difficult. In the midst of all that, somehow he manages to find his way, but unfortunately, the parrot is dead. That's the end of part 1.
unfortunately, starting with the death of the parrot. Part 2 begins in an atmosphere where it's hard to tell if it's Kyungha's dream, reality, or something that happens after death. It starts with Inseon, who should be in the hospital, coming back home. In part 2, the parrot, which was definitely dead and buried in a small box, might actually be alive and flying around. When Kyung-ha saw Inseon at the hospital, his fingers were cut off, but now there's no sign of the missing fingers. And yet, Inseon is right in front of him. Kyung-ha can't tell if this is a dream or reality. In that state, he continues to talk with Inseon and they drink tea. And as we move toward the very end of part 2, it talks about Insun's parents' efforts to find remains related to the 4.3 incident, showing the articles and important materials that her mother collected. It also discusses a project that recreates the scene Kyung-hwa saw in her dream.
That's right. In part 3, the project comes up, which is based on the nightmare Kyung-hwa had in part 1. It involves the black painted trees on the ridge that were cut down and water keeps rising around them. Kyung-hwa shared this dream with In-sun, suggesting they film a project where they plant those trees, paint them, and capture the snow piling up on them. In-sun was doing that alone. So Kyung-hwa talked to In-sun about that dream and suggested a project to film them planting those trees, painting them, and capturing the snow piling up on them. In-sun was doing that alone. Kyung-hwa suggested that they stop in the middle. Kyung-hwa and In-sun plant trees on a ridge, guided by a candle. It's the process of finding the ridge where they will plant the trees. They hold a candle, taking turns guiding each other, saying things like, "Follow my footsteps." They go to that place and talk about why. In-sun had no choice but to undertake this project, sharing memories from her mother and their own. In the end, the candle goes out, and they both lie down in the snow. I had a fleeting thought that maybe I was going to die in the midst of it all. That's right, yes. But as Kyung-hwa finally attaches the piece of the broken charm she took, it feels like a new beginning. And that's how the novel wraps up. Why do I get goosebumps while talking about this? I really love this book. That's right. At the beginning of part 1, it starts with a story about a dream. That's right. Kyung-hwa's dream story comes up. When I first read it, I was like, what is this? I didn't really connect with it. The descriptions are so vivid that I can see the scenes, but I didn't really understand what it was about. So after finishing the book, I went back to the part where the story about the pin came up and read it again. And then I understood. It feels like a continuation. I started to wonder what that projector was all about. But as I mentioned earlier, this project involved planting trees on a ridge, which gives it a bit of a graveyard vibe. That's right. But with that graveyard-like feeling, water starts to rise from below, and while trying to escape, I always wake up. Then all the bones that were in that grave would get washed away. I think there was a sense of regret for not being able to protect them. This is actually the writers. It's not about filming Boys Come against the backdrop of May 18th. It feels more like a movie I wrote. If I think of it as the nightmare I had after writing Boys Come, I understand now why that's a nightmare. If you can't protect it, it gets lost and you have to run away to avoid the water. This is after filming Boys Come about the May 18th incident. I realized that it was the content of the book because of that next nightmare. Then there's a nightmare where I see a black sedan and I dream of following it. Now I'm holding a spirit stone. You can only speak while holding this. So I realized that he was the one who ordered the massacre. And I wanted to call him a murderer, but the words just wouldn't come out. In the midst of that, among all those people, only one man followed me, and he was also holding a spirit stone. When I looked at that man, he says it like this. He was just a boy who had grown tall. Why am I getting goosebumps again? He was a boy. He was Dong-ho. I know who was in the black sedan, someone from Yeonhui-dong. I think I know who the person sitting in that black sedan was. They were someone who used to roam around places like Yeonhui-dong.
The main culprit behind all this massacre.
That's right. So it's a dream filled with sorrow, fearing that I won't be able to protect them from being swept away by that water from the grave. There's nothing I can do, and I can only run away myself. The sorrow of being out there. I think that came out as a nightmare. In the book, it feels like my life is falling apart because of that nightmare, so I try to write a suicide note. But I don't like the note, so I keep rewriting it, and that extends the days I keep living. The book that came out then was called Farewell. I wrote a novel. I keep writing the suicide note because it's not perfect. This is the book, The Farewell by author Kang. This is a collection of award-winning works from the 12th Kim Yoo-jong Literary Award, and it includes a short story. It's a story about a woman whose snow melts and disappears in the sleet. The beginning of the novel is shocking, just like Kafka's Metamorphosis. She found herself in a difficult situation. I sat on the bench and dozed off for a bit. I woke up and her body had turned into a snowman.
Her body turned into a snowman. Then as it starts to melt, something will begin.
That's right. So there's this process of saying goodbye that we can't avoid. And similarly, there's a lot of talk about snow here, which is very sad and beautiful. It seems like it would be a book that gives off that kind of feeling, especially since it mentions snow.
They say that when you mention snow, it makes you feel a certain way. I think it's a book. It gives off that kind of feeling. From the title,
That's right.
the content, and
Yes, that's right. A long time ago, when I first heard about this novel, I should have bought it back then. This is out of print now. I wanted to buy it, so I looked into it, but they were selling it used for an incredibly high price. How much is it? It was over 100,000 won. I should have bought it. Yes, this is a book I borrowed from the library.
as I keep looking at Han Kang's books, it seems like the author really loves snow, and nouns that give off feelings of snow, color, and fragility come up often, right? They feel very light, like they melt away in the wind. And I think they go really well with winter. Overall, the author's writing style, the voice is really soft and quiet, like how the snow falls all night and piles up, giving off that kind of feeling, a calm feeling.
Author's voice. That's right.
Exciting.
But when I saw the interview on the broadcast, her voice was so nice, calm, and soothing.
So, after she won the Nobel Prize, I saw a lot of videos online of her reading her own books. I often wondered why she doesn't do the audiobook herself. Wouldn't the emotion be even more amplified if she read it herself? Because her voice and the text match so well.
It is tough for you.
That could be the case.
It'll be even harder. I have to watch that and talk about it.
It's like beginning of that transformation. You have nightmares, right? I felt like there was a lot of pressure about what she had written. So I often thought that it must be really tough for the author to write her books. Also, I recently heard a side note that after The Vegetarian, author Han Kang has written a few times on the podium. Since The Vegetarian, I've heard that she's spoken on stage a few times. That must have happened a lot.
Yes.
But this is a story that happened at Seoul Arts University, and her voice is so... She was saying that the students couldn't hear well. So please let the professor's voice be a bit louder.
That's how it was.
Turn up the volume. I heard that she talked about that.
That's an interesting episode.
And in this book, there were particularly prominent parts that had a lot of episodes and descriptions about pain and suffering. Especially when Kyung-hwa met In-sun at the hospital, there was a situation where they had to keep injecting her with a syringe, once for each finger that had been amputated, so it wouldn't get infected.
It hurts so much that I can't even speak.
I once broke my leg and had surgery. But since I can really imagine what kind of pain it is, I find myself tearing up while reading it. That feeling kept coming through while reading the book. Overall, it feels like...
What about the victims? Guess they'll add more. But it's not just the personnel. That's hard. It's also hard for Kyung-hwa. Kyung-hwa is also really hard. Yes. Ankong, and the pain comes so much as headaches that I always have to be in a state where I can't help but go to the clinic. And then she goes to Jeju Island in that condition. Have you ever been to Jeju when it was snowing? No, I've never been when it was snowing. I was a bit scared, so I didn't go because we have to go back to Seoul. According to my sister, who has been to Jeju when it was snowing, the people running cafes there prepare for it by getting everything ready in advance because when it snows, they can't do anything. They also prepare firewood in advance and stock up on food ahead of time. I went there once when it was really windy, not snowy, but the wind was so strong that I felt like I was going to be blown away. Doesn't it sound like a lie? No, I really felt like I was going to be blown away, so I was struggling to stay grounded. So I really felt like I was going to fall into the sea. But now it's snowing. Of course, just like it was mentioned in the book, the blizzard made her feel cold and it didn't pile up as it swept through, right? I can understand that.
It seems like Jeju Island is particularly affected by the weather. It's like influence from the outside. Because of that kind of power coming from the outside, there's a tragedy that runs throughout many of those books.
Since it's based on a real event, it makes sense that it has to be set in Jeju Island. And coincidentally, There's that external influence too. It's about the weather. Speaking of, no, it appears from the beginning to the end, and the novel actually starts with snow. That's right. It starts the sentence, "It's snowing heavily." And now, when I look at page 93 and read the description of the snowflakes, I can't help but feel that it somehow resembles the pain of the residents and the families affected by the 4.3 incident. Let me read this for a moment. Snowflakes are light from spaces between branches. These spaces trap sound, making quiet. Branches reflect light. It absorbs and traps sound in that space, making the surroundings truly quiet. Because the branches reflect light in infinite directions, they appear white without possessing any color. So, even though they are continuously bonded together and eventually gather to find the remains, it's an incident that the government doesn't acknowledge, so they tend to meet quietly and discreetly, and even though they seem like they could easily melt away, like victims and the weak, I felt that these strong branches can keep expanding. It gives me that kind of thought. And I think those aspects were expressed a bit more strongly on page 111. On page 111, it says, "How many times have they bonded together to grow this big? But is it still this light?" If a 20-degree snowflake existed, how large would its shape be? The 20 grams actually comes from the weight of a bird, but I think it represents the appearance of the vulnerable ones who continue to bond together, white and quietly, so I don't want them to melt away. I want to protect them and keep seeing those snowflakes. I feel that way, especially when I look at the snow in this book, Not Saying Goodbye. I often think of snow as representing the weak. In Han Kang's works, the vulnerable characters are portrayed as very fragile.
When I look at the snow, especially in this book, Not Saying Goodbye, I often think of snow as representing the weak. In Han Kang's works, the vulnerable characters are portrayed as very fragile. So they are the weak. Yes, it has a form, but sometimes it feels like it's there and then it's not right. It's not that the weak don't exist, but it's like the snow falls and settles, then disappears and turns into water because of our body heat constantly coming back to us. As the snow piles up on my face, leaving behind an afterimage and a cold pain, it reminds me of when I first arrived in Jeju Island during the snowfall.
As the snow piles up and touches my face, it makes me think of something. What comes to mind is a phrase in this book. The snow that has fallen on my body could very well be one of them. Water circulates. Your pain is not just yours. That pain runs through us, through the people of Vietnam and Jeju. Actually, rained a bit on my way here today. That's right. That rain must have been water. That was somewhere else. In winter, it can fall as snow or as rain, but in the end, it makes me feel like we are all connected.
That's right.
Because of the snow.
Hearing that story, it reminds me of when Inseon ran away and her mom had a dream, as if she had foreseen Inseon's accident. That old snow. I dream of snow piling up gently on the face of a living child. But if it's on the face of a living person, the snow should melt because of their body heat, yet it doesn't melt and just keeps piling up. Does that mean this child is dead? The snow should melt, but since it doesn't and just keeps piling up, it reminds me of the snow that once covered those who were killed in the past. Is this what snow represents? A hardening? Insun and Insun's mom. It seemed like it acted as a link that continuously connects the victims who suffered. As I read,
Yes, that's true. I guess so. There's that the relationships of those snowflakes that I saw decades ago in life and recently in a dream embrace your life, as if it's the most terrifying logic that connects you to your mother. It's like the most terrifying logic that connects us through that snow from our mothers. That's right. The impression doesn't fade away. But on the other hand, there are many instances where this snow is described very beautifully. There was a line from the writer Han Kang that said something like, "Isn't that cool?" I'll read it to you. Sounds good. It's page 89. Every time the snow settles on the wet asphalt, it seems to hesitate for a moment, like the sigh of someone who habitually ends conversations with, "Well, it should be that way." As the end approaches, the music resembles silence more and more, Like a final note, the snowflakes, trying to settle on someone's shoulder, gently lower themselves instead, landing on the dark, wet asphalt, only to disappear without a trace. This is how the snow falls and melts away. Like fingertips that hesitate to settle on someone's shoulder and gently lower themselves, the snowflakes land on the dark, wet asphalt and then quickly disappear without a trace. The snow falls like this and melts softly. If we were to express it, it would be like that. The snow quietly fell and melted away.
It disappeared.
Yes, that's right. Expressing it like this makes it so vivid, and the description is just incredible. So I remember thinking about reading while drawing lines like this.
When I read sentences like this, I wonder if the translation will be done properly.
I often think about that too. I guess I should check out some translated movies and books, right? Please do.
I'll do my best.